point out that I, more than a decade ago, wrote about my concern a fairly significant amount of debt. One former member of Congress put it this way: whoever pays the piper gets to call the tune, and foreign leaders aren't inclined to whistle Yankee Doodle. So that's the first concern. The second problem is these countries, even if they are our friends, and many of them are, they don't have an infinite source of credit. They have their own economies to deal with. Right now, the economic situation in the European Union isn't so good. And so they may want to put their investments closer to home, especially if they see Congress heading out on another huge spending spree. And some of the candidates right now have certainly been talking about that. And so the question we're asking is, are we approaching a time when this excessive borrowing could make the United States a bad credit risk? And so that is certainly one concern. The United States, we estimate, probably has China owning about 1.5, or perhaps as much as 1.1. It's kind of hard to tell how much trillion of our debt. Saudi Arabia had another $700 billion in assets. And these are concerns because you might remember when President Barack Obama was in office, one of the things the Saudis threatened at one time was to sell off some of their treasuries. And you could see that we get ourselves in a very difficult and tenuous situation when indeed some of these foreign countries own our debt. So these countries up until now have been lending America money that they may not want to invest in America in the future. They may decide for very good reasons, including their own economic health, to withdraw some of their investments. And as they begin to do that, they would then, of course, put us in a difficult situation. So the first issue is, of course, foreign influence. We come back from the break, I want to talk about a couple of others real quickly, and that is the economic debt bomb, because if indeed interest rates go up, a lot of what we spend in terms of the federal government is interest on the debt. Well, and the interest is only a penny or a cent or 2 or 3%, not a big deal. But if it goes up more, that becomes what's called the economic debt bomb. And then I also want to address one other issue, because I've always heard people say, well, we owe it to ourselves. Or some people say, well, yeah, but it's good debt, not bad debt. I mean, after all, if you have debt on your house and your house is appreciating, that's probably a good debt. Very different than a credit card debt, because you don't have anything to show for it. So are the debts that we owe as a government good debt or bad debt? And then we'll get into some of the issues of personal debt as well. So a lot of things to cover here, and I feel the need to cover it simply because so few others are talking about it. So we'll continue our conversation right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, the opioid crisis is getting worse, but there is also good evidence that solving this crisis will require careful strategies because the problem is more complex than many might imagine. First, let's look at the crisis. Americans are showing up in emergency rooms from opioid overdoses in record numbers. According to the CDC, suspected opioid overdoses increased by 30% from July 2016 to September 2017. But as soon as you look at the statistics in various states, you see how complex this issue is to solve with a simple solution. For example, prescription opioids are driving the epidemic in some states. In other states, illicit opioids are driving the epidemic, and in a few states, it is both. That is only part of the complexity. Opioids, when used correctly, can be highly effective pain medications. They can make the difference between a functional life and a dysfunctional life. Jacob Sullum writes about how doctors are tired of the scrutiny and have booted all of their opioid patients and relegated them to a pain-racked existence. His article in Reason magazine challenges the current perception that the use of opioids always leads to addiction and death. He explains that opioid-related deaths do not usually involve drug-naive patients who accidentally get hooked while being treated for pain. Instead, they usually involve people with histories of substance abuse and psychological problems who use multiple drugs, not just opioids. He argues that we should not conflate the two groups, opioid addicts and patients using opioids responsibly under a doctor's care. We need wise and careful policies to both treat the epidemic, but also help patients dealing with chronic pain. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
My topic this hour is debt, and we've been talking about government debt. I want to say a little bit more about that, then move on to personal and consumer debt. But let me just mention real quickly, if you go to our website, pointofview.net, I think some of you might say, I'd like some of the facts and figures that you're going to be mentioning today. And this is an Outlook article, series of articles that I'm going to be quoting from. And our Outlook magazine in May actually addressed this issue. So the first section that I'm talking about here is the section on government debt. And then I'll be looking in just a few minutes on personal debt. And then we'll be drawing some material from one of my books, Making the Most of Your Money in Tough Times. And, of course, we have a booklet on debt as well. So if you find yourself saying, I'd like a little more information, I'd like to share this with my member of Congress, I'd like to share this with my family, I'd like to think about how to get myself out of debt, or I'd like to maybe reorganize my priorities, this Outlook magazine is something we're making available to you free. Simply go to pointofview.net, and there's a section where it says Point of View Outlook Magazine, the National and Personal Debt Crisis in America. Get my free copy. And we are glad to make that available to you. It's at pointofview.net, and I would hope that you would take the time to do so. If you're not already a donor to Point of View, I might just mention that this is one of the benefits that come from supporting us, and in the future we're going to have our Truth Team Week where we're going to focus on some of the financial needs that we have. And if you join with us in the Truth Team for as little as, say, $1 a day, $30 a month, you will receive that automatically in the mail. For those of you that have received it in the past but say, I can't find my copy, I don't know where I put it, we're glad to send you another copy, and it's available at pointofview.net. Let me, if I can, finish this conversation about government debt, because the rest of our time we're going to talk about your own personal debt. But again, as I mentioned, when we talk about government debt, the first concern, of course, is foreign investment in America and the impact that that might have. But a second one that I wanted to address is what I call the economic debt bomb, because what we are talking about is a situation in which, because we owe so much, we have to pay interest on the debt. Now, the interest rates have been relatively low, but they're much higher than they were before, and as a result, probably will go higher. Let's use the 8 years of President Obama's administration to illustrate the point. When President Obama took office in 2009, the national debt at that time was $12 trillion, and the amount held by the public was $7 trillion, and I'm rounding down on both of those. When he left office, the national debt was $20 trillion, with $14 trillion held in the public. The way in which that didn't completely devastate the Obama administration and the economy was due to the fact that even though the debt was going up significantly, but at the same time, the interest rates were very low. But that is, I think, something that is part of the past. When the interest rates were low and kept from skyrocketing during the skyrocketing debt, it didn't put too much of a financial burden on the federal budget. Let's look ahead to 2020. By that time, the national debt will probably be $23 trillion, with approximately $18 trillion held by the public. And that's a reasonable estimate from the Congressional Budget Office. And when the interest rate was 1%, well, the cost of servicing that debt was significant, but not overwhelming. But now that the interest rate is, 3 times higher, and probably will go higher, you can see the possible concerns that this might have. Matter of fact, one Congressional Budget Office scenario for next year, the year of 2020, predicted that over half of all the personal income taxes would be required just to service the national debt. In fact, the annual debt service in that year, if that trend continues, will exceed our Social Security obligations. So you can see we've got some real problems. These are questions, by the way, to ask before we go any further of individuals that keep telling us that we need to spend more. Whether it's Democrats who really want to go on a spending spree, at least those running for the presidency keep coming up with all sorts of ways in which we can spend even more money than we're spending right now. But even many Republicans as well will say, well, we'll just spend this, or we'll put this project on hold, but we'll spend money on another project. You just got to begin to ask yourself the question, what kind of resources do we have left in order to fund some of those? And economist Paul Samuelson reminds us that really the problem facing America can also be found in the world economy, which he estimates to have a debt load of about $247 trillion. So it isn't like there's another country that could even bail us out, assuming a country would want to do that, because they have problems of their own because they're spending more than they're taking in. Which brings me to one last point before we take a break, and that is good debt or bad debt. You know, one of the things we've heard over the years is that a debt is not bad if my guys are in the administration. And so I'll point out that, for example, when George W. Bush was president, there were people that voiced concern in his cabinet meetings about, well, what about tax cuts? Would this lead to larger federal deficits? And allegedly, Vice President Dick Cheney replied by saying, well, deficits don't matter. Well, interesting enough, then when President Barack Obama was in office, you have economist Paul Krugman writing for the New York Times. Man, by the way, is an economist who actually wrote that debt is good. And because he has a Nobel Prize to his credit, it was easy to believe that he settled the discussion. But it's interesting how his tune changed the moment President Trump took office. And that's kind of been the scenario more recently. And here's something I've mentioned before on the air, but it's worth mentioning again. Most political commentators won't tell you this. When economists like the president in office, the national debt isn't a big deal. When they dislike the president in office, the national debt is a catastrophe. Sadly, of course, the national debt goes up year after year, whether we have a Republican president or a Democratic president, whether we have Congress controlled by Republicans or Democrats. Now, to be fair, Democrats tend to spend more and faster than Republicans, but you really have to go back a long, long way in American economic history to find a time in which we balanced the budget. The closest we've come in recent times happened in the 1990s when they claimed that they balanced the budget, and this happened under the Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, and President Bill Clinton. But even those weren't really balanced because they were borrowing from the Social Security Trust Fund. But that's the closest we've come to anything that looked even like a balanced budget. And that, of course, was in the 1990s. You have to go back even further than that before you find a government that actually balances its budget. So interestingly enough, the argument being made by Paul Krugman, I'll get back to that, was that issuing debt is a way to pay for useful things. And we should do more of that when the price is right. He says the United States suffers obvious deficiencies in roads, rails, water systems, and more meaningfully, the federal government can borrow at historic low rates. And so his argument was, just a few years ago, actually debt might be a good thing because we can rebuild the roads and rails and water systems, and the interest rates are low. And while that might have been true when we had low interest rates, first of all, that's no longer the case. But here's the bigger problem. Most of the money being spent by the federal government is not being used to build infrastructure. You know, those so-called shovel-ready projects turned out not to be quite so shovel-ready after all. In most cases, we were borrowing money to fund social services. So again, good debt, bad debt. As we get into the whole issue of your own personal debt, borrowing money to fix up your house, probably really a good investment, especially if someday you decide to sell your house for more money. Borrowing to fix up your house is very different than borrowing money to use on your credit card to buy an expensive meal that is here today and gone tomorrow. So again, you can see that we are, as a country, been running into debt and borrowing more and more money. That is not a good prescription for the future. So when we come back from the break, I want to move from government debt to personal debt. And that is to recognize that just as we recognize America as a country is in debt, so Americans are in debt as well. And what does the Bible have to say about this? What are the different types of debt that we find individuals into? And certainly, I hope that this would encourage you to get out of debt, because certainly the scriptures are very clear that indeed when you are in debt, in Proverbs 22:7, it says the rich rule over the poor and the borrower is a servant to the lender. Probably better translated, a borrower is a slave to the lender. Get yourself out of slavery, get yourself out of debt. We'll talk more about that right after this.
There is no more dangerous time than when things are going well. Remember Elijah on Mount Carmel? Fire came down. There was no doubt who was God, but what happened next? He went from amazing faith to a time of great fear and depression. Many Christians have been very thankful a certain Democratic candidate for president was not the one to nominate two replacements for the Supreme Court. But as with Elijah, times of great victory are also times of great danger. Moments like this are not the time to take it easy. This is not the time to let our guard down. This is a time to double down on our work in the community, to serve and pray and plan and invest in a better future. This is the time to join Point of View's Truth Team 360 to make sure today's promising gains are not lost tomorrow. Show your commitment to our future by visiting pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Ask to join the Truth Team. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again talking about the subject of debt. And let me just mention that one of the resources I wanted to provide to you free of charge, it is the Outlook magazine, and some of you may have already received it if you're a donor to Point of View. Came out in May, but you may have misplaced it or you'd like to find it again. This is a PDF which we can send out, and all you have to do is go to pointofview.net, click on that button there that says Point of View Outlook magazine, the National and Personal Debt Crisis in America. If by chance some of you say, well, I don't have a computer or I don't know how to read it on a PDF and I'd like to get a printed copy, I'm sure you can just give us a call or leave a note. And of course, you're very familiar with the fact that we do provide resources to you so that you can contact us. And if you'd like to get a copy, like to make that available to you, because this is an issue that deserves more attention. And that's why I'm giving you an opportunity to not only read these magazine articles, but also to apply them to your life. We spent some time talking about the government. Let's talk about personal debt, because as I said just a minute ago, not only is America as a country in debt, but Americans themselves are in debt. And that's because of choices they've made about consumer goods, lifestyle choices, educational opportunities. Debt isn't necessarily wrong, but the level of personal debt indebtedness today should be of concern to so many. I cannot overemphasize the significant impact of debt on our society. It has been, as we've documented before with some of our economic advisors that have been on this program, the leading cause for divorce. It's a reason for many troubled marriages. It's one of the causes for depression as well as suicide. And the level of personal indebtedness in this country is a relatively recent phenomenon. Matter of fact, I spent some time in my book, Making the Most of Your Money in Tough Times, talking about some of the history, because less than a century ago, you didn't even really have anything that were like credit cards. Yes, you could go into the general store and say, put it on my tab, and people would eventually pay that, but that was pretty unusual. We did not have credit cards. Mortgages were pretty much unusual there as well. Some of those began to proliferate more when GIs returned from the war, but you have to recognize that it was a relatively recent 20th century and now 21st century phenomenon about that. And so as a result, we are dealing with a level of indebtedness in America and in many other countries around the world that is unprecedented. There are some countries where debt is not as encouraged as it is here, and where savings is encouraged, and I've used some of those examples on the air, but that certainly doesn't seem to be what we find here in the country of the United States or in many of the European countries right now. So what does the Bible have to say about debt before we get into the different forms of debt? Just a minute ago, I read from Proverbs 22, verse 7, the rich rule over the poor, but the borrower is a servant to the lender. And if you think about this, the Bible says quite a bit about money. Many of the parables that Jesus uses are about money. And certainly there is the idea that when you borrow money and you are then in debt, you're putting yourself in a situation where the lender has a greater influence over you. If you're looking for some other verses, there are certainly some that we can talk about in the Proverbs, which are certainly replete with lots of examples. In this particular article that I've written about your personal debt, I talk about Proverbs 17, Proverbs 22, Proverbs 27, and others. And so we can certainly see that we are warned about going into debt. Now, the other day I did mention on the air that some people have maybe misinterpreted at least one passage in the New Testament, and that is in Romans 13, verse 8. It says, Paul says to the church there in Rome, owe nothing to anyone. And so that has been a teaching that some churches have used to say, well, that means that Christians could never go into debt. And although some have tried to argue that this verse prohibits debt, you really need to see it in the context, because the passage is really not so much a specific teaching about debt, but rather kind of this idea that we have a duty as Christians to government authority. And more importantly, I've said as well that if the Bible really were to prohibit debt, then why does the Bible say so much about debt? I mean, as a matter of fact, it talks about various principles that you would use in terms of debt. So I think you can recognize that it's probably a misunderstanding of that verse to do so. And there is also, I think, a very important distinction we should make between debt and credit. We made a distinction a minute ago between so-called good debt and bad debt, but credit is very different. Often in our society, the two words are used interchangeably, but debt is something that is owed, and the Bible does not prohibit borrowing. It certainly does not recommend it, but credit is the establishment of a mutual trust between a lender and a borrower. We could argue that some people even actually end up in debt to do no fault of their own. They've been swindled in a business. They have made a good faith attempt to start a business, but were unsuccessful. They might have been cheated out by a supplier. They may have been unfairly sued in court. They may have had to go into debt to care for a loved one. So I recognize that debt doesn't necessarily mean a moral failing, but it does mean that it does put you in a very difficult set of circumstances. And so that's one of the reasons why I wanted to address it as well. What are some of the kinds of debt? Well, the first would be credit card debt. You know, I've said before that as Americans sometimes criticize the federal government for going into debt, they might want to look at their own credit card statements, because now the estimates are that the credit card debt for Americans in general is about $1 trillion. Matt Schultz, who is the senior industry analyst for creditcards.com, says that the record should serve as a wake-up call to Americans to focus on their credit card debt. He even adds that even if you feel your debt is manageable right now, know that you could be one unexpected emergency away from real trouble. And that kind of reminds me of something I wrote about years ago in terms of a study that was done by the Federal Reserve Board. They actually surveyed Americans, and they asked respondents, how would they pay for a $400 emergency? And they found that 47% of respondents said they would cover that expense by either borrowing or selling something. In other words, the argument was they couldn't come up with $400 any other way. Now, in a very insightful article that appeared in The Atlantic by Neil Gabler, he said, who knew? You know, and then he answers, I knew because I was one of them. I found that every time I would have new bills, I didn't have a check to pay for them. And so he said you could look at his resume as a writer and even conclude he was doing fine. He was in the middle class, even the upper middle class, with 5 books and hundreds of articles. But he called this the shame of the middle class. And one of the financial analysts even said you're more likely to hear from your buddy that he's using Viagra than the fact that he has credit card problems. And so back to our article that appeared in Outlook, when you start looking at this situation, you recognize that many Americans are borrowing, but they're not paying it off. It's one thing to have a credit card and pay it off every month, but more than half, 55%, don't regularly pay off their credit card in full. Even greater concern is that about 37 million credit card accounts had a 90-plus day delinquency mark as a result to their credit report last quarter. And the credit card debt seems to be increasing while the incomes of Americans are increasing. So that brings us back to whether or not we're living within our means. Something else that was kind of interesting, credit card debt increases by age. The average credit card debt for Americans under 35 years of age is about $5,000 plus, but 45 to 54 is about $9,000 plus. So you can see over time that increases rather dramatically. And the average American consumer owns usually at least 3 credit cards, and the average interest that they pay is more than 16%. So that is certainly one of those kinds of debts you want to pay off. But when we come back from the break, I'll talk about a few other of those debts and then conclude with some of the consequences of debt that the scriptures talk about as well. So again, if you would like to find out a little bit more about this issue of debt, maybe this would be something helpful in terms of your own planning, or if you'd like to just maybe use some of these facts and figures to share with your family members or your member of Congress, again, go to our website, pointofview.net. You'll see a banner there that says Point of View Outlook Magazine, the National and Personal Debt Crisis in America. Get your free copy, and all you need to do is give us your name and address and email so we can send the PDF to you. If some of you would like a printed copy, of course, you can contact Point of View there as well, and we would be glad to send one of those out, and certainly encourage you to learn a little bit more about debt and the impact that it is having on your life and on the government. We'll continue our conversation right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Got a few more minutes talking about the subject of debt, and if you find yourself saying, I'd like to look at some of the material that you've been reading from and summarizing, you are welcome to go to our website, pointofview.net, and find this particular Outlook magazine in which we focus on the subject of both government debt and personal debt. And in these last few minutes, let me talk about some of the other kinds of debt. Auto loan debt is another one of those issues where you have, again, the collective debt in terms of auto is at about, again, $1 trillion. About half of Americans rely on an auto loan to finance a vehicle. And so that illustrates, again, something that is changing. Back in 2003, About 74 million Americans had auto loans. Now it's 108 million, so that has gone up dramatically. And sadly, millions of auto loans are in delinquency, a fact that sometimes we are, as Americans, taking out loans with repayment periods longer than the time they plan to own the vehicle. And so that obviously illustrates, again, a very bad investment. At least you have something concrete, but it is a depreciating asset, so that's something to think about. And the one that's been in the news quite a bit lately is student loan debt. And the reasons it's in the news is because the amount owed is about $1.5 trillion by more than 44 million borrowers. If you've listened to this program, we've pointed out that when you look at, say, the baby boom generation, or even the so-called baby buster generation, those individuals did take out loans, but it was about a fourth of them did. By the time you get to the millennial generation, it is more than half. And so you can see that, first of all, that is due to the unbelievably skyrocketing cost of higher education. And as a result, the average college student will graduate with $37,000 in student loan, and that's the average. I've certainly seen some that almost go into the six figures. So, and the student loan delinquency rate, I might just mention, that's the so-called default rate, is very significant as well, at least at 10%. And so this is why it's become quite a political issue here in America. Well, we can talk about debt all day, but what about the consequences of debt? How do we get out of debt? Some of the consequences, first of all, of course, I talked about in Proverbs 22, the rich rule over the poor and the borrower is a servant to the lender. It really is a reminder that debt can be slavery. You've always heard the old phrase, I owe, so it's off to work I go. And really, if you're deeply in debt, I mean, it constrains your choices about buying a new car, about moving, about going on a vacation. So that is one of those situations. I do point out in the article that a lot of people that are in debt sort of deny reality. They hope that they're going to win the lottery. They hope that if they just ignore the debt, it will just go away. But probably the greatest concern is just the incredible amount of stress that debt puts into our lives. And so there, I think, is just an incredible need for us to come up with some different ways to begin to get out of debt. And in my book, Making the Most of Your Money in Tough Times, I have a whole section on how to get out of debt. But let me mention just 5 very quick points before we end the program today. And the first is to establish right priorities. How many times when we had a certified financial planner in this studio or somebody by phone, they want to remind us that, first of all, God owns it all. You see this in Psalm 24, in Job 41. And so as a result, sometimes we think that we own it all, but really we are just stewards of the resources God has placed in our hand. And so I think it's really important to recognize that in terms of our debt, in terms of our lifestyle, in terms of our giving, we need to honor the Lord in all that we do. Number 2, stop borrowing. It's really interesting because you have some unbelievable statistics that show that even after sometimes people file bankruptcy, and they, you would think, had learned their lesson from all of the problems they had economically, they maybe last 6 months before they start borrowing again. And I've used the illustration that if a pipe breaks in your house, the first thing you do is shut off the water before you stop mopping it up. Or another illustration is if you find yourself in a hole, stop digging. And so that is certainly the case. Don't use your credit card. Don't take out a bank loan. Start thinking about what is the next step. Number 3, of course, is to develop a budget. And there are all sorts of great ministries out there that we've made available to you in the past that help you begin to come together with a budget. You begin by making a list of your monthly expenses. That's your mortgage or your rent, your utilities, it's your groceries, it's your car payments, your credit card bills, all those kinds of things. And then really try to establish some kind of priority for the loans that you want to start to pay off, and try to pay them off in a systematic way. I've suggested sometimes that the priority should be if you have one set of debt and credit cards or loans that have the highest interest rate, pay those off first. If for no other reason, then that is the one that is probably burdening you the most. If they're all about the same, then maybe there's a value in paying off the smallest one, because then you would have to be able to cross that off the list, and you'd have a sense of success, a sense of momentum going in the right direction. And also, if you find yourself, after you've created a budget, write to your creditor with a repayment plan so that that individual understands that you at least have a realistic budget and you're really trying to address the issue. Number 4, that is, begin to retire your debt. And this is one I was mentioning just a minute ago. If they all are of different rates, then I would want to pay off the highest interest rate first. If they're all comparable, you might want to pay off the smallest one just so you have some level of success. And finally, number 5, develop new spending habits. Because if it was spending that got you into that debt, and sometimes it isn't, sometimes it has to do with health reversals, sometimes it has to do with all sorts of problems that you face because somebody swindled you out of a particular set of circumstances or finances, or you were sued in court or whatever. But if it was spending that got you into the problem, then changing your spending habits will get you out of the problem. And, of course, there's a lot more we can say. Even in an entire hour, we haven't covered all the aspects of debt. But I did want to address it, as I said before, for a couple of reasons. Number 1, because we have this Outlook magazine that we wanted to make available to you, and that is something that you can have access to. Of course, we have this little booklet on debt that we've been making available to our donors. And I think, if nothing else, this is a good illustration of why your support to Point of View will provide you with some of the resources to address some of the very difficult economic circumstances you find yourself in. But more importantly, in the first half of this hour, you heard us talk about government debt. And I think it's about time to start asking some of these individuals that are going to be knocking on your door, sending you letters, making phone calls, wanting you to vote for them. We need to know what they plan to do to get the United States out of debt, because each year the deficit is there. And that means that the national debt grows every single year. And at some point, we are going to find that there are some economic consequences, some very dire economic consequences to not addressing this issue of debt. So that's one of the reasons why I wanted to cover some of this. And again, let me encourage you to look at our website today. And you can, first of all, find the Outlook magazine. And that is something we want to make available to you. If you go to the very bottom of the page, there's a search engine there. You can type in the word debt and finance, and you will find many of the other articles we've posted in the past, which I hope will be of use to you as you begin to look at the problems of government debt and your own personal problems of personal debt. So that's all we have for today to address this issue of debt. And I appreciate you listening to Point of View. And if you would like to find more, it's all at our website, pointofview.net.
Why should you become a partner with Point of View Radio? Because for decades, this team has made a significant difference in lives and communities across the nation. Because America is dying for lack of biblical wisdom about life and culture. You should give because your gift will make possible cutting-edge information on issues that matter, information you won't hear anywhere else. Why? Because your gift will change lives, because you'll influence our culture with biblical truth, and because you can make a difference for the future. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Click on Join the Truth Team and choose your level of support. Pointofview.net, or call 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151, or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is our weekend edition, and certainly we are thinking right now of those of you that are in North Carolina that are being hit by Hurricane Dorian, as well as those of you in Florida, Georgia, and South Carolina that have been devastated in one way or another by that. So we'll certainly maybe focus some time and attention on that. But as we always like to do, we want to focus on some very important issues. One of those, the first article here, written interesting enough by the Supreme Court Justice Neil Gorsuch. Now, it's kind of a summary of something that's in his book on the separation of powers, and that'll get us into some of the religious liberty conversation. Then some criticism of an individual, that Drew Brees, who is in the football realm, but also has supported Focus on the Family, which also leads to one of the other articles as to whether or not the National Rifle Association is a domestic terrorist. As a matter of fact, I love the piece by Jim Garrity. You can't call people terrorists just because we're having a different point of view. So we have those issues. Of course, we'll always look at the issue of religious liberty, as we always like to do on Friday. And to help us out with that, Jeremy Dice with us, Senior Counsel with First Liberty Institute. And if nothing else, the more I read about Neil Gorsuch, I'm not a lawyer like you are, but the more I read him, the more I like him, and the more I think it was such a great selection by Donald Trump to put him on the Supreme Court.
You know, I just enjoy reading his stuff. The way he writes, just the reading of it all. You know, in law school, I remember going through case after case after case of stodgy decision after boring decision after dust-ridden textbook again. and then you would come upon either Justice Scalia or Justice Thomas.
Yes.
And you just have this, like, salve put on your eyes, finally, of after having suffering through all the other boring justices that have written over the years. They actually are good reads on things. You know, lawyers get a bad rap for writing in kind of a technical way, and some of that is necessary and important. But Justice Gorsuch took a cue from Justice Scalia as well, Justice Thomas too, and they've really taken to making their decisions readable and enjoyable. To the extent where Gorsuch has got sort of a reputation of how he even begins his opinions, and they're always kind of set out the same way, kind of an upbeat tone and a unique way of opening all of his decisions on things. And some of it are called it the Gorsuch style, right? That this is how you open up a brief or whatever you have. Anyway, all that to say, I think Gorsuch, in addition to his clear reasoning on things that are originalist, textualist in nature, he's an enjoyable one to read, which I think will mean that his decisions will be read more often by more people, which will hopefully help us understand our republic even better.
You know, one of the things that he is talking about here is separation of powers, and in my July commentary, I talked about the fact that even back then, in another case that we'll talk about, he was criticizing Congress because he said a vague law is no law at all. It provides no reliable way to determine which offenses qualify as crimes of violence. And the point he was making is kind of, you know, he even talks about this here. When you take a high school civics class, you learn that the legislature is supposed to legislate. The judicial branch is not supposed to legislate. It's only supposed to interpret the Constitution. And that, I think, Jeremy, is the fundamental difference between, say, the progressive idea that says if the law is vague, well, I'll step in as a justice and fix it. Or if the law is wrong, I'll step in as a judge and fix it. Whereas the typical kind of more conservative or constitutional view is,
if you passed a bad law, go back and do it again.
Yeah, that's right. And not only does that relate to the judiciary, but it also relates to the other branches of the government as well. When the legislature delegates to the executive, it can cause actual harm on citizens. When the judiciary oversteps its bounds and does what the legislature ought to have done, it causes harm on real Americans as well. And that's his broader point, is to say, look, be careful. The reason we have the separation of powers is to preserve our freedoms, not just to preserve individual power within those branches of government, but it is actually to avoid wreaking havoc upon American citizens and the real lives that are going to be impacted by those decisions.
I might just mention this is the first article, and you might want to read it, but I'll give you a brief summary, and then I'd like our lawyer here to go into it in more detail. But in the first case, it's where the legislature did that, delegated some of the powers to the executive branch, and that caused a problem. In the second case, it's about how the judiciary just rewrote the statutes to make a better policy. And the third is where the executive assumed that it had the judicial power to make the law. And you have some examples, even in modern times, some individuals saying, I've got a phone and a pen, and I can do that. Or we'll just write the Affordable Care Act and constantly say, as the Secretary of Health and Human Services shall determine. And I get the sense that Neil Gorsuch will have none of this.
No, I think you're right. And he ends the piece very pointedly by saying it's one thing to study the theory of separation of powers. For me, it was another thing, and he's talking about in his time as a district court or a circuit court judge, it's another thing for me to witness how its disregard affects the lives of people, of real people in real cases. You know, that's just his humanity showing through.
Yes.
And it's kind of characteristic of Justice Gorsuch to say, yeah, these are weighty, legal, philosophical, academic issues that we've got to grapple with, but let us not forget that they actually cause impacts upon real human beings, and we call them our neighbors, our friends, our family. It will have an impact on there. So it's one thing to study these things, whether that's in law school or through government classes or degrees that you may pursue in history or political science or what have you. And it's even different than just simply having a discussion within the legislative context about a policy. These are real impactful decisions that are going to make an impact on people's real humanity. And what does that also mean? It's also going to mean how they're able to self-govern themselves, which is also very much tied very much to the point of freedom itself. So when you boil it down, yes, it has the effect on real people with real lives and real cases, but it has a real impact on the overall ability for us as a free people to be a free people.
And I think the examples he uses are great because he talks about a small business having difficulties, talks about an individual that was actually violating the law because he was a felon and couldn't have a firearm, but didn't know he was a felon. And so you can realize how that affected him. Then
which is a funny little point, just to break in there, because we're probably sitting here right now violating some federal criminal law of some sort. You know, it's
the Heritage Foundation's pointed that out. We're all in violation of something.
Of something, right? There are, 4,000 different criminal penalties out there right now. You just simply cannot keep up with them. And so at any given moment, you could be hauled away for simply doing something you thought was particularly innocent, like this gentleman did here, and found himself, on the wrong side of jail on that. So that's why we want to have this reduced governmental state that is so pervasive and controlling over top of us that we can't even follow the laws that they actually put together. That's why the old adage of government governs best when it governs least is so true, and also when it governs localist, or the smallest, I guess is the best way to put that. The best form of authority is the smallest form of authority. And that gets to us right down to the family structure.
Well, it certainly does. And again, I mentioned that small business, an individual that was in violation of having a firearm when he didn't even know he was a felon. And the other one, a Mexican citizen married to a U.S. citizen, father of 4 U.S. citizens. So as you said, one of the things I appreciate about Neil Gorsuch is he doesn't just look at the abstract nature of the law. He recognizes it affects real people, and those are the kind of people you want on the court. When we come back from the break, let's talk about viewpoint discrimination. We've talked about that a few times with Jeremy Dice and Drew Brees. He plays for the New Orleans Saints. We'll talk about that in just a minute. And even the San Francisco group of individuals who actually are supposed to be calling for some organizations to no longer associate with the National Rifle Association because it's what? A domestic terrorist organization. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Michael Yosef warns us that we face both external threats and internal threats in his new book, The Hidden Enemy. We face an external threat from radical political Islam. That does not mean that all Muslims are an enemy. He has great concern and passion for Muslims, having been born in Egypt. His broadcasts go into the Muslim countries to proclaim the gospel, but he is well aware that radical Muslims want to sweep away Western civilization and impose a global caliphate. The internal threat we face is from a coalition of secular humanists, atheists, and leftists. They want to erase America's Judeo-Christian values and replace them with relativism, sexual liberation, and hedonism. He calls this the Great American Delusion. Humanists and atheists have been successful in transforming much of America through the media, the courts, the educational system, and popular culture. He also recognizes that these two groups could not be more opposed to each other in theory, but there is a surprising alliance that sometimes has developed between Muslims and humanists. His book provides some interesting details and examples of how this has happened in the past. Now, near the end of the book, he also talks about another enemy inside the church. He reminds us that some believers in the past opened the door to the false religion of Muhammad. He sees a similar accommodation today where church leaders in certain denominations are preaching a false gospel. It is another warning that we should stay true to the gospel and reject those who want to try to make the Bible relevant to society by making the church and the Bible conform to society. This book will help you understand the threats we face and encourage you to take a bold stand for the gospel. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let me just mention that this particular segment now, and even for a while, we're going to talk about what is oftentimes called viewpoint discrimination. And we've used some great examples. In just a few minutes, we'll point you to a very good piece that is in First Liberty and the ongoing battle for Aaron and Melissa Klein. So again, I would encourage you to go to firstliberty.org, and the thing that will pop up there is that. Also, Coach Kennedy, another issue that is on that website, so we'll certainly talk about that. Monday, my commentary is about Blaine Adamson. We've talked about him as well, that actually had a case go to the Kentucky Supreme Court. He's won at the lower court level, both the trial court and court of appeals, in which he said, look, there are just sometimes when, as a shirt manufacturer, I can't print a message. And interestingly enough, has even had another lesbian print shop owner say, yeah, I don't want to be forced to print issues as well. But sometimes when you have a viewpoint, then they're calling for all sorts of actions. And since it's football season, let's talk about Drew Brees. He is a quarterback for the New Orleans Saints. This particular article I have here said one of the most upstanding people to ever play in the NFL is currently under assault. His sin? Well, Drew Brees appeared in a video connected with, okay, you ready for this? Focus on the Family. And just by encouraging people in a Focus on the Family video to encourage students to take their Bibles to school and live out their faith, there had been all sorts of reaction to this, and if nothing else, I wanted to address it on a couple of issues. First of all, he's free as an individual to do so. Jeremy, also help us out. I think students are allowed to take their Bibles to school, are they not?
I mean, it's really, really incredible. And, you know, I don't know if you're okay with doing this, but I'm going to make the suggestion maybe while we're talking about this, they can find in the control room the video from bringyourbibleschool.org, whatever it is, and let's play the video. And it's only like 15, 30 seconds. So if we got a chance to pull that up and play it, I think it'd really help set the discussion, see how divisive and vitriolic and hate-filled this video actually is.
Lots
here.
of sarcasm here. Yeah.
Are we? I mean, that's what the headlines are leading us to believe, that this Drew Brees guy is the worst thing since Hitler walked the ground here. He's an uncompassionate, hate-filled person that's going to cause students to be bullied in class. That's going to cause them to commit suicide. I mean, this is what they're saying on Twitter and other places, that this, by associating himself with this message, that they're actually able to do that. So, I mean, I think it's only fair that we listen to this and know how not to behave ourselves, because we don't want to drive ourselves, do we? We don't want to drive people to suicide and being beaten up at school and being ostracized and all these things. And for goodness sakes, we ought to know what a false prophet looks like here. I don't care if he plays football. We ought to know what this guy is like. So, do we have the message? Can we play that video or not? I don't even know if we have it.
Pull that out. And let's just put this in perspective. If there's anybody out there that's probably kind of on the forefront of the anti-bullying campaign, isn't it Drew Brees?
Oh, my goodness. How many times has he been on the Ellen DeGeneres show?
Yes.
Ellen and he are big fans of the anti-bullying thing. And so they've been working together to curb that. Why? I can't speak for Ellen, but I can probably guess at least to his part of that, which is to say that he's motivated by his Christian faith to make sure kids are not bullied. But, of course, all that is now undermined. I think we have the video, so let's cut to the
listen
tape.
to it. Okay.
Hey, guys. Drew Brees here. One of my favorite verses in the Bible is 2 Corinthians 5:7. For we live by faith, not by sight. So I want to encourage you to live out your faith on Bring Your Bible to School Day and share God's love with friends. You're not alone.
Well, that's it. There it is.
Oh, that bigot. Oh my
okay,
gracious. I hope he is sacked multiple times this coming weekend. Goodness gracious, that is awful. You take your Bible to school to show God's love to your friends. Oh, how could he dare do this? Oh, my gracious, this guy is awful.
Yes. Well, Jeremy's really getting you wound up. So let's open up the phones, get your comments, 1-800-351-1212. Maybe even some of you from New Orleans, because I know we do broadcast
it's possible
in Louisiana.
That some of you have actually dared to show God's love by showing people the Bible as well. And I hate to tell you, but you are a horrible human being. I can't believe you would associate yourself with such a hate-filled organization. Am I making my point yet?
Yeah, you're making your point. You are making your point. And it has been interesting because then there have been some that have also connected it to CK. That's our acronym for Colin Kaepernick. And I love this particular person saying, it's not this. First of all, it has nothing to do with Colin Kaepernick, but everybody's always reaching to try to pull in Colin Kaepernick. And I love this one person saying, I'm going to go out on a limb here and suggest that Drew Brees has a job in the NFL because he's one of the 5 best quarterbacks to ever play the game and will own nearly every major record by the time he retires. And fortunately, even with all the vilification that has happened and all of the vitriol, how about Reggie Bush? He'd know him, actually ran with him and ran behind him and was a teammate. Said anyone who doubts Drew Brees' character or believes these bogus headlines about this man does not know him, period. He's a good father, a good husband, a good leader, and most of all, a true man of God. But almost all of this is because Drew Brees has done a short, you just heard it, video for Focus on the Family. That says a lot, doesn't it?
All those things that Reggie Bush has said and that the comparisons to Kaepernick, that's what the patriarchy wants you to believe. Yeah. That this guy is actually that kind of thing. This is the establishment talking here and trying to build up this Brees guy and try to provide him the cover he needs here to be have the platform for bigotry that he's got to have. Okay, I'm going to stop being so sarcastic, but this one has set me off pretty badly here. Look, this is the serious
the
point.
NFL season. The Green Bay Packers and the Chicago Bears. Packers won last night. Played the first game, and we're going to have all sorts of games Sunday. And I can't imagine if there is not going to be at least some commentator when Drew Brees steps on this field to talk about the controversy surrounding Drew Brees.
Well, he probably eats Chick-fil-A too.
Oh boy. There's a twofer.
I don't know here. But look, here's the serious point in all this. Drew Brees, and please watch what is happening here. Drew Brees is being excoriated. He's being dragged through the mud. He is being libeled, frankly, and mocked mercilessly. He's being, I would not doubt this at all, he's having discussions within his camp right now, within the Saints organization, about whether he's gone too far. He's probably going to be called into meetings for diversity meetings and tolerance, inclusivity kind of things that will teach him how to better behave and how to communicate so that he's more inclusive in nature. In fact, his own apology invokes some of those terms already, which is a little bit disturbing, but I'll give him a bit of a pass on some of these things. Look, this is what happens to you if you go into public and admit that you believe in the thing that he tells kids to bring to school with him. In fact, you need to understand that it is entirely possible that if your kids actually follow his advice and bring their Bible to school, they in fact could be targeted themselves for being hate-filled bigots. Mm-hmm. And they might, in fact, receive harsh criticisms, not just from their classmates. They may, in fact, receive some reprimand or some sort of discipline from their teachers, especially if they decide to congregate together with other like-minded individuals who brought their Bibles and do such a dastardly thing as sit in the corner at lunchtime and together read that Bible. Mm-hmm. Or, like my client, Giovanni Rubio, who did it during free reading time, just silently reading that book and was told that he could not read that book, that religious book in that classroom, and was threatened with discipline if he did. These are the things that go on in our schools today. Now, look, I'm telling you what could happen, but what I want you to understand is that Drew Brees has done the right thing here. Mm-hmm. He is free to exercise his religious beliefs wherever he's allowed to exercise them. And he's got a human right to be able to do that. He also has the freedom to be mocked for doing that. And in fact, Christ told us that he would be mocked if he did do those things. And so your students as well, maybe they don't have the same kind of notoriety as a Drew Brees does or whatever, but your students may also receive that kind of disdain from the world around them. And you, mom and dad, need to come around those kids and say, it's worth it. It is worth it to suffer the name of Jesus Christ by carrying your Bible into school, because by doing that, you are holding a testimony to your Savior on these things. So don't be afraid to do that. Don't be ashamed to carry that Bible into school on, September 13th, be part of back to school or bringing your Bible to school day. And if any teacher or principal or superintendent or school official of any kind reprimands you, tells you can't carry that around, can't quote it during a classroom assignment or during a school discussion or what have you, you give First Liberty Institute a call, because we want to represent you for free and put that thing back to rights. I hope the Saints try to fire Drew Brees, because I would love to represent Drew Brees on this kind of thing and set things back to right here. No one, and I mean no one, should be punished by their employer or by the government for simply saying you should read the Bible.
That's really amazing. You dealt with a situation where, after we come back from the break, a sports broadcaster who believed in traditional marriage and tossed him out as well. So let's open up for some comments, because then after that, I want to talk about the San Francisco Board of Supervisors that have also declared the National Rifle Association as a domestic terrorist organization. So if you have some thoughts, I'd love to hear them. 1-800-351-1212. We'll be right back.
Here's some great news. If you missed the deadline to sign up for health insurance, or more importantly, if you sign up for a plan that you're just not happy with, you still have a choice. It's called Medi-Share, and Medi-Share is a Christian healthcare sharing program. It's been around for 25 years. They have more than 400,000 members now around the country. And get this, over the years, Medi-Share members have shared more than $2 billion of each other's medical bills, so they could help share your needs too. And best of all, you could save a lot of money with Medi-Share. The typical savings for a family is around $500 a month. Your savings could be more or less, but think about what you could do with that extra money every month. So if you think you're stuck with a high-cost health plan that doesn't have much to offer, think again. You can join Medi-Share anytime, so call them today and check it out. There's no pressure. They're super easy to talk to. 855-90-BIBLE. That's 855-90-BIBLE. 855-90-BIBLE.
It takes a team to win. Be part of Point of View's Truth Team and bring truth and healing to America. Go to pointofview.net/team, pointofview.net/team, and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you would like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212 is Weekend Edition. And Jeremy Dice has done a masterful job with a little bit of sarcasm of illustrating the issue of Drew Brees. And let me just for a minute talk about some practical aspects, because Bring Your Bible is going to be actually October 3rd, but See You at the Poll is September 25th. So that means there are two opportunities for you to educate your children or grandchildren. And if they are prohibited from doing something, then I think you have to click on that picture we have of Jeremy Dice that takes you to firstliberty.org, and you would love to take one of those cases.
Oh, that'd be
wouldn't you?
fantastic. And by the way, those are the dates that are set aside for these particular things, but that doesn't mean you have to go only on those days to the poll to pray, or only on October 3rd to bring your Bible to school.
Right.
You can, students, don't forget, you have the most rights of anybody on that campus, and you have the right to talk about your faith in class, outside of class, in the hallways, in the lunchroom. You've got the right to talk about it in your class assignments. Pretty much everywhere you go, you can talk about your faith. Here's the only little qualifier. Just don't disrupt the educational environment of the school, right? And here's how you would do that. This is what I call violating the stupid for Jesus rule. Stupid for Jesus is still stupid, so don't be stupid for Jesus. That's the rule. And so if you get up on your desk and start reciting, "Oh Captain," or I always say "Oh Captain, my Captain" because it's from Dead Post Society.
Yeah.
If you get up on your desk and start reciting the sermon from Mars Hill that Paul preached, you're being stupid for Jesus, especially if you're doing that during algebra class. That doesn't work. But you know what it is. You know where the lines are.
Right.
Be respectful. Talk about it in your class during the class discussions. Don't blurt it out in the middle of a lecture on trigonometry. I mean, heck, I wasn't even awake during the lessons on trigonometry, so I wouldn't have been doing that myself. But do it right, and you're going to be fully protected. But make sure you do these things on the, what is it, September 23rd for the See at the Pool?
Yes, see at the Pool is September 25th, and then bring your Bible to school on October 3rd.
October 3rd.
And like I said, those are just dates that they gave us, but I just thought I would mention it. And back to those of you that maybe just tuned in a minute ago, we played this very short clip that Drew Brees, quarterback for the New Orleans Saints, did for Focus on the Family, and the hue and the cry and the criticism that he's received, one, because he talks about the Bible, two, because it's with this hate group, Focus on the Family, which is not a hate group, but I mean, it is just amazing how quickly the culture has turned against some of these great institutions like the Bible, like Focus on the Family, like churches. And one of the things that Drew was mentioning just a minute ago, this is our Andrew, is that a lot of the people are saying, well, this is a hate group because they believe in traditional marriage. Well, that'd be the definition of virtually every evangelical church in America, wouldn't it?
Yeah, and even Drew Brees' own family. I mean, they all profess the same thing. By the way, I got to give our producer credit for not only finding that video, but having his finger hovering over the censor button, because he didn't know what was coming out of that video and was sure he's going to bleep one or two things during that whole time. So I'm very impressed that he was able to, to preserve our tender ears of our listeners from any kind of well, if you were offended by what Drew Brees said, I'm deeply sorry. I guess we're going to have to segue into the next story. Going to have to label him, Drew Brees, now a domestic terrorist for having to support these things, right?
That is our second article. And again, if you didn't see this, we ignored it for a day because I just like to bring some of these just so I can see Jeremy's head explode. But and again, having grown up on the
that's a bald joke there somewhere, but
the San Francisco Board of Supervisors. I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, so it didn't really surprise me. But by unanimous vote, the supervisors of the state of California and in the city of San Francisco passed a resolution declaring the National Rifle Association a domestic terrorist organization, urging other cities to follow their example and to take every reasonable step to limit business interactions. Now, the first question I have is, what interaction does San Francisco have with the NRA anyway? But more to the point, you're a terrorist organization if you are engaged in terrorist activities. You're not a terrorist organization if you don't like what the person has to say. And that's the piece that I've posted here by Jim Garrity. You can't call people terrorists just for having a different viewpoint. But in this woke society, Jeremy, sometimes that's exactly what happens.
Yeah, and Garrity makes the great point that the city of San Francisco, as loony as this decision may be, is free to have that opinion.
Sure.
And he says this very clearly. He says they're free to have those views, meaning that they think that the NRA is awful, that they loathe the NRA. And this is the quote, they loathe the NRA and vehemently oppose their views on the Second Amendment and the right to own a gun. They can have those views, Jim Garrity says, but they do not have the authority to declare someone else a terrorist for having that different view. We've come now down to the point where we are labeling that we have, let me rephrase that. We have come down to the point where you have city officials who have been duly elected by one of the biggest cities in this country who are using taxpayer time and focusing all of their legislating abilities on declaring people who exercise not just simply a right articulated in the Constitution, but one that has been ordained by God to self-defense, a domestic terrorist. This ought to, in any other rational period in history,
yes,
it would lead to the ouster of people because of their mental capacity.
Yes.
I mean, it would lead them to actually question whether or not these individuals
should be in office,
should be in public. There is a level of crazy here that needs to be checked on all this. But we are living in the different age today where people are actually saying this is actually a brave. People will praise and have praised the city of San Francisco for doing this. And that's probably even more frightening, that there are supporters of people doing this, to bring in the full weight of the government to say that the NRA is a domestic terror organization. So what does this mean in practical terms, though? And Garrity goes through a few of these things. Now, will someone who works on, is a contractor with the city of San Francisco.
That's what he brought up, yeah.
And they happen to be a card-carrying member of the NRA. Are they now discredited or removed from the contracting provision? Don't forget the Department of Labor just, 2 weeks ago, outlined a new proposed rule that would say, hey, if you're a person of faith, you can actually do business with the federal government. Before then, you couldn't.
Isn't that amazing?
Right? And so now you're seeing the city of San Francisco take the opposite tack. Then I recognize we're outside of the area of faith, but how long before a Drew Brees, let's take Drew Brees. He's a great example of this again. Yeah. What if Drew Brees' organization that helps kids with bullying, and my guess is Drew Brees goes into public schools all around the country to combat bullying.
Right.
Can he go to San Francisco now and teach on anti-bullying? Will the city of San Francisco also say you cannot contract with the public schools in our city to teach on anti-bullying because you are a bigot associated with Focus on the Family, and therefore they're going to pass a new resolution, I suppose, that says that anyone associated with Focus on the Family or has donated to Focus on the Family or is a member of Focus on the Family is a domestic terror. Now, that's not what they've done yet, but it's only not even a hop, skip, or a jump away from doing that very thing.
Yeah.
If you're going to label those who exercise a constitutional, fundamental human right to self-defense, in this case through the use of weapons, as a domestic terrorist, then how hard is it for us to believe that you would label someone who engages in any kind of speech with which you disagree a domestic terrorist as well? We must pull this back. This has gone way over the edge, and our society is running fast as can be right over that edge with it.
And for people who think that we're overreacting, think of Chick-fil-A. Already certain states and certain cities have said we don't want Chick-fil-A. Certain universities have said we don't want Chick-fil-A. We already see Drew Brees and Focus on the Family. And I guess back to this whole idea of the San Francisco Board of Supervisors, the reason I emphasize that it was a unanimous vote is even in the craziness of San Francisco, having grown up in the San Francisco Bay Area, I just think there would have been at least one member of the Board of Supervisors that said, guys, is this really even worth our time? We've got a poop map in San Francisco, so people can't go to certain places because we have a homeless problem. We have places where there are drugs and needles, and we are losing people from this city almost every day because we're not addressing some of these issues. Wouldn't we be better spending time as the Board of Supervisors addressing something else? But yet it was a unanimous vote.
It's the unanimous decision of the Board of Supervisors of San Francisco that you are free to defecate on the public streets, but you cannot exercise your First Amendment freedom of association nor your Second Amendment freedom of the right to bear arms. That's a bridge too far. But by all means, do the former thing, right? And we'll put that little project of yours on a map, so others will know where to avoid or observe your masterpiece. I don't know what it is, but that's the level of crazy that we're dealing with. And people in San Francisco, I certainly hope you're paying attention to your leaders here that are more interested in whether or not someone is exercising their fundamental freedoms that we did not give to government to interfere with, and yet permit people to excrete human waste in public. Well, that's fine, they say, but dare bring in your fundamental freedoms That's gone way, way, way too far.
Well, let's take a break. I suspect some of you have some comments, so let's open up the phones. 1-800-351-1212. If you find yourself saying, I got to read this for myself, well, that's why we posted it. First article on separation of powers. Second on the NRA. Is it a domestic terrorist organization? We haven't even talked about the global warming issue, which we'll get to later, right after these messages.
New Zealand powerlifter Laurel Hubbard recently took 2 gold medals and 1 silver in women's heavyweight categories at the Pacific Games in Samoa. Laurel is one of a growing number of male athletes competing and, unsurprisingly, dominating and setting records in women's sports. Hubbard is now looking to compete at next year's Tokyo Olympics. The International Olympic Committee requires that transgender men desiring to compete in the women's division of a sport meet certain requirements, including staying under a maximum testosterone level for at least 12 months prior to their first competition. Testosterone makes men bigger, stronger, faster, and makes it easier for them to add muscle mass. Lowering maximum allowable testosterone levels is supposed to remove any advantage enjoyed by biological males when they compete in women's sports, but it doesn't. A peer-reviewed study published in July in the Journal of Medical Ethics shows that transgender athletes who were born male but identify and compete as females have an unacceptable advantage over biological females in athletic competition. Researchers from New Zealand's University of Otago conclude, quote, "The advantage to trans women afforded by the IOC guidelines is an intolerable unfairness." Their paper stated that even when healthy biological male test subjects had their testosterone levels suppressed below the Olympic guidelines, they, quote, "did not lose significant muscle mass or power." The study also found that muscle memory allowed these biological males to retain or rebuild their muscle mass through training. NCAA and IOC officials may insist otherwise, but giving biological males opposite-sex hormones post-puberty does not negate the athletic ability-enhancing effects of testosterone on the male body. There's simply no level playing field achieved here. In today's climate, where it's dangerous to tell the truth, the New Zealand researchers were bold to publish their conclusions. We need more scientists like them. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Once again, Jeremy Dyson studio with us, and I might just mention that even though Penna Dexter's not here today, we did just play her commentary, and you'll have a chance to hear it a little bit later. But again, when we're talking about craziness, talking about this power lifter, a man who now claims to be a woman, who actually took 2 gold medals and 1 silver medal at the Pacific Games, and now is wanting to qualify for the Olympics. We have a picture of him, now her, and it looks more like a him than a her, but I'll leave it at that. And, of course, the International Olympic Committee says that they need to stay down under a certain level for testosterone. So we'll come back and talk about that later. But just all sorts of just incredible insanity.
Why would you have to stay down a level?
Yeah, well, I mean, to make it fair. But, of course, it's not fair, as we well know. Because
they told me growing up that I could be whatever I want to be when I grow up.
You didn't know that was going to be as widely distributed and defined as you thought it was.
Someone has lied to me along the way. I mean, I wanted to be Bumblebee my entire life anyway, you know. Maybe Megatron, but you know, Goodness sakes. I can't. You're telling me I can't actually be Bumblebee now?
You
They
can't
said
be
I could be
Bumblebee.
whatever I want when I grow up.
There you go, Bumblebee.
Man.
Pretty incredible. Let's just, before, I'm going to leave to the next hour because this is going to create all sorts of interesting reaction. CNN this week, of course, had about 7 hours and 10 different presidential candidates talk about climate change. And
coincidentally, the CDC recommends you get 7+ hours of sleep every night.
Yeah.
So interesting how they had 7 hours of climate change and the country is all caught up.
It's all kind of very good. So we're going to talk about Kamala Harris. We're going to talk about Bernie Sanders. We're going to talk about all that. But I thought just before we get into that, because that's almost an entire hour, next hour, is that let's look at a couple of these kind of viewpoint discrimination kind of cases, one of which is one that we've talked about in my commentary on Mondays about Blaine Adams. And now that's not your case, but it's similar in that you have an individual that has been doing a print shop. And they said that, well, because you weren't going to actually print a message promoting a gay pride festival, that you actually are on the opposite side of the LGBTQ issues. I point out that, first of all, he's declined certain things that you would think to be Christian, like he declined to print a picture of Jesus on a bucket of chicken, even though a local church asked for it. And he has printed materials in the past for a singer who, by the way, is a lesbian. And so he's won at the trial court, the Court of Appeals, now the Kentucky Supreme Court. And what's so interesting in this case, Jeremy, is Kathy Trotvetter is an owner of a print shop in New Jersey. She's a lesbian. And she says, I support him because I may agree with the LGBTQ message, but I disagree, vehemently disagree, emphatically disagree with forcing people to print a message that goes against their conscience. Because if indeed they can force Blaine Adamson to print a message he doesn't agree with, they could force me to print a message I don't agree with. And so I think it illustrates, again, sometimes the critics don't understand if they actually produce certain kinds of policies, it'll come back and hurt them as well, won't it?
It will. And I'm glad to see someone waking up going, hey, wait a minute, this could impact me.
Yeah. What about that?
What if Mitch McConnell, to use someone that is a regular foil against the people on the other side, what if Mitch McConnell wants me to print campaign shirts for him? Well, I couldn't do that. What the government says you have to.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, this is what it's coming down to. This is why that Blake Abramson's case is so important. That's why Aaron and Melissa Klein's case is so important.
Yep.
That's why this recent One Telescope Media that just was decided by the Eighth Circuit, I think, is so important. That we've got to protect that right to conscience. Otherwise, we simply don't have a basis on which to be able to exercise the faith that we have. If the government can, in fact, tell you what to believe and how to exercise that belief, you do not have freedom anymore, let alone religious freedom. You don't have freedom anymore. If the government is that pervasive, that in addition to forcing you to stand through enormous lines at the DMV and having to send your mail through a centralized postal service and having to pay taxes and on anything that moves, you've got to pay on, and all these other things, including the 4,000 different criminal laws we talked about earlier in the show and the millions, literally millions of regulations that are out there governing business and everything else from, what size eggshells are permitted to be used in a restaurant to, what wrench you're allowed to use to hook up a certain wire in the sky with, all these things that are out there. Now they're telling you also whether or not you can or cannot believe something. And if you choose to believe something that the government does not agree with, can they force you to believe that? That's where our freedom is hanging so tenderly in the balance right now. If the government is allowed to tell you what to believe, you simply don't have freedom anymore at all.
Let's talk about what is on the website. And again, I highly encourage people to support First Liberty. And if you click on the picture there of Jeremy Dice, it will take you to First Liberty. And the first thing that pops up is Coach Kennedy. I get more questions about Coach Kennedy than almost any of your other cases. And people always want to know, what's the status with Coach Kennedy? What's the status with Aaron and Melissa Klein? So help us out.
Coach Kennedy right now is, we're in a period of what they call discovery right now. We're trying to figure out what the other side has and how we can use that to support our case. I almost said to our advantage, which is actually true. But we're trying to use that to support our case here. What can we learn from them? In other words, the Supreme Court sent this case back down to the district court because there were a couple questions outstanding yet.
Right.
And so we're trying to answer those questions. Now, thankfully, we think we know what the answers are. We're getting the evidence to prove what that actually is. And then the process is basically going to start all over again. We're going to go through motions practices through the district court. That will inevitably lead to an appeal to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, which will probably lead, in fact, to a decision by or another appeal to the Supreme Court of the United States. And so we're back to where we were 4 years ago right now, back again to the beginning. And it'll probably work another 3 to 4 years to go all the way back up to the Supreme Court, unless somehow the Ninth Circuit wises up this time and makes a better decision than the last time they did. We shall see. So that's where Coach Kennedy's case is. And, of course, you can find out more information about Coach Kennedy at firstliberty.org. And on Aaron and Melissa Clyde's case, we're right in the middle of rebriefing all of that stuff. So the Supreme Court there, again, sent that case back down. Remember, they did the GVR thing, which if you've been listening to me before, you know what GVR stands for. But I'll remind you because I'm sure you forgot. Grant, vacate, remand. They've granted the petition that we filed at the Supreme Court. They vacated the decision below, and then they sent it back to that appellate court at the Court of Appeals for Oregon and said, hey, go do this again. And this time look at Masterpiece Cake Shop, because that was an important decision of ours that you didn't have the last time you decided this case. And so what we're looking at right now is whether or not the state of Oregon had a fair process in place. They didn't prejudge the case, and whether the state of Oregon engaged in religious hostility towards the religious beliefs of Aaron and Melissa Clyde. Now, we've already submitted our brief, and so we're waiting for the other side to now submit theirs. We said in our brief that both of those prongs of the Masterpiece test have been violated here. There was not a fair process here. There was a prejudgment, in fact, that went in place. And more than that, and worse than that, is that the state of Oregon, through its commissioner of the Bureau of Labor and Industry, Boley, he demonstrated religious hostility. And the easiest thing to point to that is to say a $135,000 penalty for emotional damages is ipso facto religious hostility. It's the clearest evidence of hostility towards religion. Yeah. Plus a gag order. That's right. You can't even talk about getting against the First Amendment. You can't even speak about something you believe in there. So we're waiting on the Supreme Court or on the Oregon Court of Appeals right now. Actually, we're waiting on the other side to file their briefs, and then we'll reply to that. But it's going to be a few more months before that all gets resolved. Meanwhile, we've got all these other cases around the country, whether or not it's ours or somebody else's, trying to figure out just how much freedom we retain, especially within the world of the First Amendment.
Yes. So again, if you would like to be an insider with First Liberty, just scroll down about halfway. It says, be the first to get breaking news on cases, gain insider perspective from experts, sign petitions. And so if you haven't already done so, that's available at firstliberty.org. Of course, we have a link there at pointofview.net. We come back, though, a long series of discussions about climate change, 7 hours worth with 10 different presidential candidates, and some comments that I just can't wait to hear Jeremy Dice to talk about. So those are articles we've posted on the website as well, so you can read ahead. We're going to take a break. We'll be back in a few minutes and continue our conversation right here on Weekend Edition. We'll be back right after this.
Is religious freedom still a cornerstone of the Republic, or has it effectively been crushed by the forces of tolerance? America needs Christians to be informed and as unified as possible, applying God's wisdom to civic life. Point of View can be a key part of a successful mission. I believe in America. I believe God wants His best for us. We can face whatever the world throws at us as long as we stand together. If you have not signed on, please do it now. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Or call us 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about this issue of climate change. I might just mention one of the things we've been making available is this booklet that I put together on climate change, which is really just a kind of about 12 pages to look at some of the issues and recommend a couple of books, because this is an issue that surfaces often. And it certainly surfaced earlier this week, in which CNN came up with this idea that let's do a 7-hour-long town hall, which, as Jeremy points out, is about the length of time that some people are to sleep. So maybe that's a good idea that you could have slept through it. But 10 presidential candidates, Jeremy, went at it. And I just picked out a couple of articles here about Kamala Harris and Bernie Sanders, but it was just a good example, first of all, of how I felt like the CNN various individuals were sort of prodding them along the way. And second of all, it just illustrates something that we've talked about on this program before, that climate change or global warming has become an excuse to vastly expand the size and scope of government.
Well, and it's even been said that's why they had the Green New Deal proposed in the first place, so they could take control of the economy on things. Let's go back to the first point, though. Who was the genius who said, in this day of partisanship and lack of civility, you know what we need more of? We need 7 hours straight of some sort of town hall.
Who came up with this?
With not only on just like issues of the day, we need it on climate change.
Yeah.
I mean, there wasn't even a band involved.
Yeah.
Like, if you're going to have 7 hours on climate change, you better have a couple cool bands that are out there to talk about it all.
Well,
Sing about it.
Anyway, I just figured I'd pick out a few. Let's do Bernie Sanders first. I guess that's the simpler one. And that is, I posted one of these articles, and there are quite a number. Alexandra De Sanctis has talked about Bernie Sanders advocates population control in poor countries. Of course, I posted this one from Red State. Bernie Sanders reaches a new level of depravity. Doesn't matter which one you read, but this one, I think, illustrates a point that we've made before, and that is you can't really understand some of the current environmental movement unless you go all the way back to when the so-called Earth Day began, and you had population control, and you had the population bomb by Paul Ehrlich and those kinds of things. And so here you really have Bernie Sanders saying, well, maybe the real solution to climate change is abortion and birth control, and let's just see if we can just reduce the population of the world, and maybe that will be one very significant solution to
It's not just
change.
reduce the population of the world. This is reduce the unwanted population of the world. And those are almost his exact words.
Yes.
He said go into the poor countries that are predominantly, if I'm not mistaken, and please someone correct me if I say this wrong, but I think he even said where brown and black babies are not being helpful to the overall population that are, I think what he said was that are predominantly populated by brown and black babies.
Yeah.
This is awful.
Malthusian.
Yeah,
and,
well, I mean, that's a big,
Planned
fancy
Parenthood.
$60 term that most Americans don't know what that means. So let's put it in real terms. Bernie Sanders is proposing that the solution to global warming, and frankly, if you don't agree with this, you are part of the problem, he would say, is that we need to cull the Earth's population. There are some human beings in this world that don't deserve the right to reproduce. Think about that, folks, you do not deserve the right to reproduce. I don't care if he's put that on modern-day Americans in Beverly Hills or students at college in Guatemala. It doesn't matter. Or maybe there's people on the street in Chile. It doesn't every human being has that innate right to be able to do the very first thing that God told us to do, which was to subdue the earth and populate it. That was it. That's our duty as human beings. And Bernie Sanders says, no, that basic duty that God gave to you in Genesis 2, that actually is causing global warming because there are so many people sitting on this planet. Okay, now let's take that little issue there, Mr. Sanders, Senator Sanders. I saw a graphic here the other day of the island of Manhattan. And on the island of Manhattan, there was a giant blue cube erected on it. It was several city blocks, of course, and about as high or higher than the old World Trade Center, or maybe the current Trade Center, Tower 1. That would fit the entire Earth's population side by side in that cube.
Yes.
On the island of Manhattan.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think we're in any danger right now of overpopulation at all. But even assuming we were, the solution to overpopulation is not some people get to have babies and some people don't. That is there have only been a few people in history that have talked that way, and history has always, without exception, condemned them.
Yes.
And I don't mean to get our argument to reduce to the old logical fallacy of reductio ad Hitlerum, but that's where this is going.
Sure. That
if you get to choose who is a worthy race, who is a worthy individual, who has the rights of full humanship, then you better stay away from power, or at least we better keep that person away from any kind of power. To borrow from Lindsey Graham and his apoplexy when Justice Kavanaugh was being railroaded by the left in the Senate, I hope that they never get power, because my gracious, what would they implement on here?
That's
that
right.
Some people would be able to have babies, but others would not. The rich people would be allowed to have babies, but the poor people would not. The interesting thing also on top of this is Senator Sanders has not walked any of that back.
That is even more striking, although there have been some responses. But let me get into, like you said, some of the history. And this is a 4-page article that you can read at your leisure. And, of course, it does use some of those big words like Malthusian, but let's just explain what that is. Basically, this is kind of the idea of the eugenics movement. Malthus said that we have an overpopulation. Eventually, we're just going to have too many people. And so that was one argument. But more to the point, those followers of Charles Darwin, including his cousin and some others, actually began to propose what was called eugenics. And one of the big supporters of that was Margaret Sanger, Planned Parenthood. One of the other supporters was, Adolf Hitler, and, of course, others along those lines. And so when you start down this road, you're, in a sense, focusing attention on something that is a very sad chapter in American history. And we even have a Supreme Court justice that said, 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. And so we've had a sad history with this. And now you have a serious, I guess he's serious, presidential candidate making the same kind of statements.
I'd like to ask Senator Sanders to pick which one of his grandchildren should be the first to go.
Yeah.
Which one of his grandchildren should be removed from this earth because that child is overpopulating the earth? In fact, if he's so committed to this overpopulation thing, why is he allowed to stay? He's old.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, maybe we should just say, you've served your purpose in this lifetime and your time on this earth is now over. You need to sacrifice yourself for the greater good. That's the level of thinking here that, well, frankly, isn't being done, or at least if it's being done, it's being ignored on things. Look, every human life is valuable and worthy. But why does Senator Sanders think that we ought to prevent some nameless, faceless human that is in a foreign country somewhere in Uganda, Rwanda, or wherever, that those individuals, because they are poor, are overpopulating the earth and causing climate change on a global level, that they should be prevented from having human beings repopulating the earth, and yet he gets to suck out the oxygen in the room.
Yeah. And again, he wants to fund abortion to poor third world countries, and especially those countries that have a lot of black and brown babies. I'm amazed that, first of all, he got away with it. I'm amazed that he hasn't walked it back, and I'm amazed there are other Democrats that haven't said, whoa, wait a minute. But we want to hear your comments, too. 1-800-351-1212. Oh, yes, there's a lot more. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Michael Yosef warns us that we face both external threats and internal threats in his new book, The Hidden Enemy. We face an external threat from radical political Islam. That does not mean that all Muslims are an enemy. He has great concern and passion for Muslims, having been born in Egypt. His broadcasts go into the Muslim countries to proclaim the gospel, but he is well aware that radical Muslims want to sweep away Western civilization and impose a global caliphate. The internal threat we face is from a coalition of secular humanists, atheists, and leftists. They want to erase America's Judeo-Christian values and replace them with relativism, sexual liberation, and hedonism. He calls this the Great American Delusion. Humanists and atheists have been successful in transforming much of America through the media, the courts, the educational system, and popular culture. He also recognizes that these two groups could not be more opposed to each other in theory, but there is a surprising alliance that sometimes has developed between Muslims and humanists. His book provides some interesting details and examples of how this has happened in the past. Now, near the end of the book, he also talks about another enemy inside the church. He reminds us that some believers in the past opened the door to the false religion of Muhammad. He sees a similar accommodation today where church leaders in certain denominations are preaching a false gospel. It is another warning that we should stay true to the gospel and reject those who want to try to make the Bible relevant to society by making the church and the Bible conform to society. This book will help you understand the threats we face and encourage you to take a bold stand for the gospel. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Jeremy, you're talking about that one obelisk there in Manhattan. The other ones I've used in previous commentaries is that actually if you had everybody stand side by side, they'd fit in one city, Jacksonville, Florida. And people say, no. And I actually run the numbers and show that indeed you could put 7 billion people in about 2.2 square feet. Says that's about how much people take up there, and that would be about the size of Jacksonville. Or if you took all the people in the world and give them about 1,000 square feet, that'd be a small house and a small yard. You could put all of them in the state of Texas. So
I'll tell you, I've been on some planes where I thought the entire population of the world was shoved in there with me.
So again, that just gives you an idea of that if you're talking about overpopulation, yes, it's maybe poorly distributed. It does feel very overpopulated when you're in Hong Kong or in New York City. But there are whole sections, as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was pointing out recently when she was criticizing the Electoral College, where she was showing on Instagram all sorts of farmland where there's nobody out there at all. So that is certainly one of those issues. And another one is, of course, this whole idea of we just have too many people. That goes back to zero population growth and the zero population group. And I found out just recently when I was looking up something about a professor that I had at Yale that he was one of the founders of zero population growth. But there has been this attempt to just completely stop any kind of population growth. And if you go to Europe, it's actually declining right now. It's declining in Australia. It's growing in some other countries, but they've unfortunately been able to achieve that. And that's not exactly what Genesis says about go out there and subdue the earth and be fruitful and multiply.
That's right. Look, and I need to back up what I said earlier about black and brown babies. That was not something that Senator Sanders said, at least in that clip that I was thinking of. He did talk about how poor people need to make the decision to not have babies, but that was a slightly different take from somewhere else. So, Senator Sanders, I apologize for putting the wrong words in your mouth, but the point he's making is still the same, that we need to have fewer babies, not as many or more babies than we're currently having. I always find it interesting that the typical proponents of overpopulation are from the city or from condensed areas. So Vermont is it is a pretty heavily condensed area of humanity. But when you go out to Wyoming and Montana and South Dakota, North Dakota, the Heart Belt parts of the country here, there are enormous areas where there is nothing. And that's just North America. We haven't even started talking about all the other parts of the world that have huge empty places within them that can sustain life within them and can welcome not only people but also the things needed to have people live there, like food and water and all the other kind of things like that. So we've not even begun to come close to this. So if you're hearing people talk to you about climate change and blaming it on overpopulation, just reject that thinking and point them to the vast open spaces in our country and around the world that are free yet for us to populate, and remind them that the solution to overpopulation is not to kill other lives. That's a dangerous road that leads us down. I would encourage you to ask that question. Okay, if you believe that overpopulation is the problem, look into the eyes of your children and tell me, which one should we remove from the face of this planet?
And again, I sometimes use that when people say, well, what about this issue of rape and incest on abortion? And I say, well, I've had a number of individuals here that were conceived because of rape or incest, and it's hard for me to look in their eyes and say, well, you shouldn't be alive right now. And it's the same kind of argument that you would certainly want to put to them, because lots of times they want to put the onus on us. Well, let's put it back on them. And back to the key issue, Bernie Sanders in this argument said that women have a right to control their own bodies, make their own reproductive decisions. Well, then he goes from there and says, well, the Mexico City Agreement, which was something under the Reagan administration, which denies American aid to these organizations around the world to get abortions, that's wrong. And so, again, it isn't just somebody talking off the top of their head. It's also policy that would change dramatically, because you have had the promotion of abortion from the Obama administration. You have not had that under the Trump administration, and you certainly would have that under a Sanders administration.
You certainly would, and not only under a Sanders administration, but under a Warren administration, a Harris administration, a Booker administration, an O'Rourke, all of them, and however 20-some-odd members there are. Are we into the 20s now? I can't remember. There's been people that I think have pulled out of the race. So, all of them are not. Sanders is not unique and alone in his policy here. This is a fundamental tenet of the Democratic Party. It is a plank in their platform. And if it's not, it will be even more so when their platform writing comes along here pretty soon.
Well, and again, we've talked about Bernie Sanders, and we'll take some phone calls, 1-800-351-1212. And that's on the whole issue of birth control, abortion, and the rest. But I put up another one because Senator Kamala Harris, who has a chance of being the next Democratic nominee as well, this illustrates, Jeremy, to me, that climate change is being used to say, I'm not only going to encourage you to spend more money on trying to find renewable sources of power, but I'm also going to tell you how to eat. And this is a very clear statement that she made about the fact that she would like to change the dietary standards and guidelines so we'd eat less meat. If we eat less red meat, we have fewer cow emissions. I'm using the quite term on that regard. And so limiting meat would be just one more thing that would be required because we believe in the danger of global warming and climate change.
Well, I mean, a little known fact here that you may have seen during this 7-hour marathon that former Vice President Biden had an issue develop with his eye. His eye started to bleed.
It's red, yeah.
He had actually just read this story that caused his eye to bleed, I think. I mean, look, we're getting down to now that you can't use a straw because we're going to kill fish in the sea because it'll find its way into the ocean and whatever. Meanwhile, you have Japan right now deciding they're going to dump a bunch of water from the damaged Fukushima power plant. So this radioactive water, they're going to be dumping where? into the ocean.
Yep.
But for goodness sake, don't put your bendy straw into the trash can, because that's going to find a way and damage flipper. And then on top of that, you can't have a hamburger. Pete Buttigieg even joined on this as well. Again, this is not something that is alone to Kamala Harris. It's not something that is unique to Bernie Sanders. The entire slate of candidates will hold the exact same position.
Mm-hmm.
Buttigieg said the other day, well, I think it was during this entire
7-hour marathon.
snooze fest, that he said that if you are using a straw and you are eating a hamburger, you are part of the problem. You're part of the problem.
Can we eat our hamburgers through a straw?
That's my plan. Is that I think it is now time for all of us to be starting to eat our hamburgers through a plastic straw as well, not just a paper straw, because you wouldn't be able to get a hamburger through a paper straw. It would, break before it even had a chance, and you'd be sucking down wet cardboard. But yes, that is now, I think, our American duty is to go to your nearest hamburger restaurant and request that hamburger to be fed to you through a straw. I mean, actually, that used to be the insult, right? If you did something bad, someone would say, I'm going to make you be able to drink your hamburger through a straw because you mush you up so bad. But this is where we're at now. This is a badge of honor to eat hamburgers through a straw nowadays.
Well, I've been postponing until now some of the phone calls, so let's take a few of those. We'll go to Georgia. And Julie, what's your point of view?
Yes. When you were discussing the statements by Bernie Sanders that were so outrageous concerning abortion and, I guess, third world countries, and I think the comment was made that, the shock that more Democrats were not appalled by this and the other candidates were not speaking out against it, and that he hasn't walked it back. But really, I'm not shocked at all, because it seems to be the main litmus test for every Democrat candidate is abortion. And pretty much if they meet that litmus test and they're pro-abortion, they can say pretty much anything. And so I wasn't shocked at all. I mean,
yeah, and we were only sort of half shocked around the table. We're just, but it is just amazing some of the most outrageous things that have been said. And when we come back from the break, let's get into it a little bit more because we have a lot of phone calls that want to weigh in with some comments. And you did also talk about Joe Biden's eye bleeding. There is a call now for them to release Joseph Biden's medical records, which were last released 11 years ago. So maybe, of course, he's also had some interesting statements to be making. So we'll see where that takes us. But we'll take some more phone calls. And I want to get back to this whole idea of is it becoming more and more bizarre every day with some of the statements being made by some of the Democratic candidates? And as Jeremy has aptly pointed out,
is it becoming?
It sort of looks like it, and so we'll see if we can do a quick analysis of that, because these ideas, which were outliers not so long ago, are becoming mainstream in the Democrat Party.
Yeah, so stick around. If your eyes don't bleed, your ears might.
We'll take a break. We'll be back right after this.
Point of View is committed to spreading the truth, oftentimes a truth that those in political power don't like getting heard. But the only way it can be heard is if our teams stand strong together, if you do what you can to support the Point of View Truth Team. It's having an impact, as we heard recently from U.S. Representative Louis Gohmert.
Everywhere I go, I hear people that you have influenced, that Point of View has affected. You have made such a difference, and you rely on people to contribute, and if they don't contribute, then that truth does not get heard.
Help Point of View make a difference. Pray and consider what level is right for you. $30, $65, $100 a month, or even more. Please do what you can. 1-800-347-5151, or visit online, pointofview.net. Look near the top right for the link that says Become a Monthly Partner. Join the Truth Team, 800-347-5151, and pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Jeremy Dice with us, Senior Counsel with First Liberty Institute. We, of course, talked about some of the religious liberty issues, and I thought I would just put on the table some of the conversation that surfaced after 7 hours of a town hall and CNN. They're going to cover some other issues in the future, and, of course, we have 10 candidates, it looks like, that will actually qualify later this month for the third Democrat debate. But the issues, Jeremy, are all over the map. Medicare for all, Green New Deal, of course, relates to this one. Abortion until birth, free college tuition, guaranteed basic income, comprehensive gun control, legalizing illegal immigration, reparations for LGBT, voting age to 16, ending the filibuster, abolishing ICE. The list goes on and on and on. And many of those ideas, just even 4 years ago, would not have been even on the table, even for the Democratic Party. So some things have changed dramatically in these last couple of years.
And now they're not just on the table, they are the entree to the nomination. You must believe these things as a base minimum in order for the party to actually nominate you, which ought to tell you, those who are, if you listen from the Democratic Party here, if you've been a classical liberal that welcomes a variety of opinions to the world, but you have a different view on the function and form of government, your party has left you. Mm-hmm. It is no longer what you thought it was. Now, if you are a person of faith within the Democratic Party, there's a resolution for you as well that says that people of faith are probably not going to be welcome in the public square.
We haven't talked about that yet either.
There's all kinds of things that are going on to show an increasing hostility towards religion by the Democratic Party, and this is one of the two parties that you have to choose from. So you may not like the things that are going on in the Republican Party, and for goodness sakes, I've got my own kind of concerns about not only the GOP, but its putative leader right now. But for goodness sakes, at least they're not saying, let's go into foreign countries and cut and make sure that we can fully fund abortion so those poor people don't live anymore and overpopulate the earth. At least they're not doing that kind of thing. My gracious, I'm surprised that list does not also include, do you prefer Chick-fil-A or Popeyes? I mean, it's going to get down to that at some point.
And it certainly is. And it's just an illustration, again, of what used to be outliers not so long ago are kind of mainstream. And as you point out, if you stray a little bit off of the liberal plantation, you really pay a heavy price, as we have seen before. One of the individuals I'm going to be talking with next week is Dennis Prager. He'll be in studio. We're actually going to have to tape it because he won't be here when our show is. But he's pointed out before that you have conservatives, you have liberals, and then you have the left. Now, it used to be that I treated the left and liberals as the same word, almost synonymous. But what he means is a typical liberal, and you can think of Alan Dershowitz, been on the program with us before, would say, look, I may disagree with you, but I defend your right to say that. Mm-hmm. Does the left say that on a college campus anymore? Does the left say that in some of these debates? No. So I sometimes want to just say, you liberals out there, the classical liberals, come and join us who still believe that there's a free flow of ideas.
Yeah, and the sad thing about that, too, pardon my interruption, but the problem with that is that it has actually pulled the conservative party to the left a bit, mm-hmm. right? So whereas you used to have to go pretty far to the right to be a conservative, you don't have to go nearly as far anymore to be a right. So Alan Dershowitz and I would have a lot of disagreement on things. Now, we do both agree on that principle of, hey, I may disagree with you, but I'll defend your right to be disagreeable. He and I will walk across that bridge together, but that may be one of the only bridges that we actually find in common here. There are a lot of positions that he would hold that I find abhorrent.
Of course.
And I'm sure there are positions that I hold that he finds abhorrent.
Yeah, of course.
But we don't label each other as bigots or domestic terrorists or anything like that. We see that we're both Americans and can have grown-up disagreements with one another and still call each other Americans.
Yes. And again, when you start saying that I'm going to tell you that you should not eat a hamburger and you should not use straws, And if you do, you're part of the problem. That comes from a man that I thought was sort of positioning himself as a little bit more of a moderate in the Democrat Party. So if he's saying that, that shows you how far Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, Kamala Harris, and some of the others are. And, of course, we'll see this in the next presidential debate later this month.
Meanwhile, you have reports out there about children being terribly injured by steel straws that they carry around and fall on. Because their parents are so worried that their overpopulation of their own children are going to ruin the earth through these straws somehow. And you just had a recent story out there to disprove this whole theory that you shouldn't even have a hamburger. It actually is telling us that those who are vegans are at a higher increased rate of having strokes. So, I mean, I'm stopping at In-N-Out on the way back to the office this afternoon to deter that stroke that may be coming out there because I had salad last night for dinner.
Okay, well, it's going to take some phone calls here. And this has really been a great program for Jeremy Dice and Cecil in South Carolina. What would you like to add to our conversation today?
Yes, thank you for taking my call. I wanted to comment on some remarks that people made concerning people not having a lot of children or having a lot of children.
Go for it.
But it tells us specifically in 107 Psalm, the 41st verse, that the Lord is the one who decides who's going to have children and who's not going to have children. So he says he setteth the poor on high and gives them families like a flock. And the poor people depend on their children to help them survive in this world. That's why he allows them to have so many children. So we need to try to be scriptural when we talk about these things.
Good point.
Thank you for my call.
Yeah, it's very good. You know, and that's the thing is that this idea of the old stop at two or one child policy in China or zero population growth and all of that. I mean, let's just face the reality that families used to be a lot larger in the 19th century because in those families, especially in our agricultural society, each child was a net benefit to the family. But if you find yourself in some of these third world countries, Bernie Sanders says, well, this is really bad. Well, no, as Cecil points out, some of those children are helping plant the crops, bring the crops in. And for us to say, well, you can't have more than two children because of my particular bias, American bias, which is not a biblical view whatsoever. It's just kind of crazy, isn't it?
Yeah, look, and Cecil's right. We do need to be careful and make sure we're being scriptural about this. And I don't think we've departed from that. I mean, we said at the beginning that this is ignoring Genesis 2 and the mandate we have from our Creator to be fruitful and to multiply. That is the base level. We just hadn't gone through all the books and gotten to this 107th Psalm yet. He's exactly right that the Lord determines who gives us children and who doesn't, and we ought to be dependent upon that, joyfully so.
And again, the scriptures in the Psalms talk about the fact that they're a blessing, arrows in our quiver, they're a gift from the Lord, and all
I've
sorts
never known someone at the end of their life to say on their deathbed, I wish I'd had fewer children.
Yeah. Good line. Let's go to Alaska. KJMP. Elmer, what would you like to add to our conversation today?
Well, I guess I'm the counterpoint to the gentleman from South Carolina. I am in a sparsely populated state, and I think that I realize that there are limits to human at any given point in time. That the carrying capacity is limited. They have laws here or hunts here for wolves and that are competitors for wild game, and the wild game. Many people like to hunt and fish for wild food, and particularly wild game. And the game has competition. And I've been here for 40 years now, and I've seen that the openings and closings. There were not many closings on fish and the closings of other seasons for caribou and moose. There are limits in these things, and there are probably limits for the carrying capacity of the land for people too. I mean, just because there's not a lot of people here, but maybe the land is not that productive given the climate.
Well, and I recognize there's carrying
and
capacities. You know, as a matter of fact, lots of times they'll issue hunting licenses because you have maybe too many deer and you want to bring them back to the carrying capacity. There are some disasters that have happened in the history of the environment in which we've had too many animals that didn't have enough predators, or there were the elimination of predators and those kinds of things. So I recognize that is part of just a wise stewardship of the natural resources. So I wouldn't disagree with that in terms
and
of...
I'd also, I guess, if I could interrupt too, in Matthew, in Matthew 19, he talks about, and Paul also has in Corinthians, but not directly, but he talks about being celibate and not marrying. Paul talks about not marrying. Christ talks in Matthew 19 about some men are born eunuchs, others are eunuchs by conviction, and some are eunuchs by coercion, and others are eunuchs by made themselves eunuchs, and it's best to be as I am. So I think there's also in Scripture there's justification for other ways to see.
But let's be very careful about that as well. That may in fact be there, but the point of that is so that the specific mission that Paul had, that Christ had, is to be fulfilled in presenting the gospel around the globe. That is not a position for us to rely upon in terms of public policy to enforce others to have fewer or less or no children whatsoever. And many on the left will try to grab that phrase, in fact, that those verses themselves, to say that's why you should have fewer children. We have a Genesis 3 world in which we're going to have to work to bring fruit from the ground, but that doesn't mean that we're going to say no more humans about it.
We'll take a break and come back with more right after this.
New Zealand powerlifter Laurel Hubbard recently took 2 gold medals and 1 silver in women's heavyweight categories at the Pacific Games in Samoa. Laurel is one of a growing number of male athletes competing and, unsurprisingly, dominating and setting records in women's sports. Hubbard is now looking to compete at next year's Tokyo Olympics. The International Olympic Committee requires that transgender men desiring to compete in the women's division of a sport meet certain requirements, including staying under a maximum testosterone level for at least 12 months prior to their first competition. Testosterone makes men bigger, stronger, faster, and makes it easier for them to add muscle mass. Lowering maximum allowable testosterone levels is supposed to remove any advantage enjoyed by biological males when they compete in women's sports, but it doesn't. A peer-reviewed study published in July in the Journal of Medical Ethics shows that transgender athletes who are born male but identify and compete as females have an unacceptable advantage over biological females in athletic competition. Researchers from New Zealand's University of Otago conclude, quote, "The advantage to trans women afforded by the IOC guidelines is an intolerable unfairness." Their paper stated that even when healthy biological male test subjects had their testosterone levels suppressed below the Olympic guidelines, they, quote, "did not lose significant muscle mass or power." The study also found that muscle memory allowed these biological males to retain or rebuild their muscle mass through training. NCAA and IOC officials may insist otherwise, but giving biological males opposite-sex hormones post-puberty does not negate the athletic ability-enhancing effects of testosterone on the male body. There's simply no level playing field achieved here. In today's climate, where it's dangerous to tell the truth, the New Zealand researchers were bold to publish their conclusions. We need more scientists like them. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View. your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes in studio with me today, Jeremy Dice. This is our weekend edition. And, of course, next week we'll have Penedexter Kelly Shackelford, but they're out traveling, and so it's an opportunity for us to hear from him. And this has just been a great program with Jeremy today. And let's take a few more phone calls. We'll go to Eliana in Georgia. I think you want to talk about this idea of eugenics. So thank you for joining us today.
Hi. Thank you for having me.
What would you like to add to us? Yeah.
Well, I wanted to say I originally was born on a third world country, and I came to the United States for the big dream. Over here, we have another kind of problems. We don't consider, the fact that the people over there that is rich is not willing to share with the poor. So protecting them like somebody was reading the Bible over there is not something that is expected. It's definitely frowned upon. So I believe that Christians should take a stance on every country, on every church, and try to get the people to understand that the poor, they don't want to have more children. They want education. They want to attain the things that others in better fortunate countries have. That is a need. And, suppressing the people, by killing them through abortion is not a good thing.
For sure.
But we cannot expect, that they just sit around and have babies if they don't have nothing to put in their mouth.
Well, again, as you said, Christians need to stand up. And if nothing else, I just think of like World Vision and all sorts of other organizations that have really tried to extend the Christian influence. We've had missionaries around the world. I mean, there's just a lot of opportunities for Christians to have a positive impact on other countries around the world.
And they are absolutely having that impact. I just finished reading a book to my boys called The Hand That Guides My Scalpel by David Thompson. It's a wonderful book. If you have a chance to pick it up off of Amazon, you really ought to read that. It's a really good read. Thompson was a doctor, a surgeon in Gabon in West Africa, and way out in the middle of nothing. And the stories that he tells will have you laughing one minute and weeping the next. They're really precious stories. But his phrase is always to say something to the effect of, I can't share the gospel with them unless I've first shown them I care for them. Right.
Yes.
And his ability to do that was to physically help them, right, to bind up their wounds, and in some cases resetting legs in their proper joints through some very unique means of producing that, to have surgeries where none existed before, and on all kinds of things like that. But he understood that the greater responsibility that he had was more than caring for their bodies, was to care for their souls. And so that was always a compliment to whatever physical act he was doing for them. And I think people of faith understand that as well, that we have to care for their souls. That's our mandate. That's Matthew 28. That's what we're told to do, is to go and make disciples, and only the church can do that. And so if that's our mandate, yes, we've got to go do that. And along the way, we do good works because we're good people.
Yes.
We don't do good works so that people will come to faith. We bring people to faith and then help them to do good works because we're good people made good by a great God.
And again, you see that with all sorts of missions work, feeding hungry stomachs so you could feed hungry souls, and taking care of the physical body so you can take care of the spiritual body. So just well said. Let's go to Illinois, WPEO there in Peoria. Terry, what would you like to add to our conversation today?
Well, you talk about in Genesis where God says to populate the earth, but also in Jeremiah 29:6, it talks about where that we should increase in number. So we are populated, our earth is populated, but it says to increase in number, especially his people, to increase so that we won't be diminished. So that his people won't be diminished. And when when there's so many people in our country that are not believing in the Lord anymore, the people that do believe in the Lord could be diminished.
Well, and the point I think is made there is, of course, it's really focusing on the Jewish culture, but still, I think the principle applies. Marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage. And if nothing else, I just have said so many times before, Jeremy, that if you look at the fertility gap, it's really striking because secular people are having fewer children, Christian people having more children. Liberal, progressive people have fewer children. Conservative people have more children. If you play that out, it's almost like the liberals are saying, wait a minute, we're going to eventually be overpopulated by conservative kids, or at least kids grow from conservative homes and Christian homes. Of course, then the universities try to convert them over to liberal progressives and secularists, but nevertheless, that's certainly been the case.
Right,
really.
It's proof again how hard it is to actually live a consistent liberal belief. If you truly believe what you say you believe, Bernie Sanders, then you wouldn't have had so many children yourself, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if you're being consistent with what you're demanding of other people and are going to stick the power of government on you to make you do, then maybe you don't actually believe what you do. I think Terry's made a very profound point, and I also like to point out the next verse in Jeremiah 29:7, which reminds us to seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you'll find your welfare. So it's not just simply populating for the sake of populating, but there's a sense there that says, hey, while you're doing this, we're not tearing down people, we're not ending their lives. We're here to seek the welfare of this city itself. We're here to make things better. So going back to Eliana's point to say, look, yeah, we want to populate the earth. Absolutely. We want to be faithful stewards of that. We want to also honor our responsibility as a mission to disciple the nations. But we also want to care for people as well. We want to do good to the city around us. And people of faith, Christians in general, do that. And let's go back to where we were with Drew Brees again. Why am I so mad that they're calling him a bigot? Because think of the enormous good that he has actually done.
Right.
I can't count on how many, and I don't have enough appendages to count how many times he's been to a hospital to care for sick kids and to take care of them and to make them smile, if nothing else. My guess is he's donated millions of dollars to some sort of hospital or health agency of some sort. He's done all kinds of good things for the anti-bullying things, and I'm all in favor of that kind of stuff. But just the fact that he actually says you should bring your Bible to school, that's enough for him to be excoriated, made fun of, put out from public society, possibly even lose his job. That is the kind of absurdity that no one with a sane brain should ever consider being rational.
Let's just, before we run out of time, talk about if somebody that is listening right now has a child or a grandchild, and they're going to see you at the polls September 25th, or bring your Bible to school October 3rd, or any other time, are told that they can't bring their Bible, they can't pray, they can't write about Jesus or something like that, and they say, well, I don't know what to do. They can contact you at First Liberty, can't they?
Please do. Go to firstliberty.org as your initial triage and find our toolkits there for students and teachers that are in the public schools. That's a great resource for you to have. Print it out, put it in your Trapper Keeper, put it in your backpack, whatever you carry things into school with. Make sure you know what your rights are. And in real quick, kind of rule of thumb kind of way, you have the right to be able to talk about your faith in school, during class assignments, in your class assignment, during class discussions, and on down the list. You've got the right to be a part of a religious club. If there are other clubs on campus, keep it on going down those things. You don't need to stop being a person of faith at the schoolhouse gates. You are welcome to carry your faith in there. And if someone tells you otherwise, give us a call. Let us figure out how we can help you out.
Well, if nothing else, I hope you'll be listening next week. Dennis Prager will be with us, Francis Chan, Katrina Pearson, Jim Dennison, to mention just a few. Just Tommy Nelson will be with us. So just all sorts of great topics. Jeremy, thank you so much. You really added a lot to the program today. It's great to have you here.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Again, we have a link to Jeremy Dice and First Liberty on our website, pointofview.net. And I want to also thank Andrew for digging up that clip for us, and engineering, and Steve for organizing all the phone calls. So I hope you have a great weekend. We'll see you back here on Monday, right here on Point of View.
It is a horrible scenario, but it happens. Dennis writes about his wife who was diagnosed with leukemia. She's now a 2-time survivor. They ran up over $1 million in medical bills. Thankfully, they're Medishare members, and Dennis says they're so thankful for that, how people came together to meet their needs. Medishare works, and it can save you a lot of money. The typical family saves $500 a month. Find out more. Call 855-SHARE-40. That's 855-SHARE-40.
Every day we face new challenges. At the time of Jonah, the Bible says in Nineveh, they couldn't tell their right hand from their left. But in America today, a bunch of people can't tell men from women. In fact, some say men can be women. Christians are called to proclaim God's truth in every area of life. But who has time to study every crazy new thing the world can think of? I'm glad you asked. Get the information you need every day with Kerby's Viewpoints commentary. Sign up to receive them via email at pointofview.net/viewpoints or find them on the Point of View radio app. Viewpoints commentaries, making sense of the world around us. pointofview.net/viewpoints. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.